Afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Atlantic Canada Association of Heritage Professionals, or ACAHP-'s Lunch and Learn on the creative work of rehabilitation in partnership with the Licensed Professional Planners Association of Nova Scotia. In this webinar, we will discuss conservation as a creative industry that is critical to sustainable development. ACAHP represents heritage professionals in Newfoundland and Labrador, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Nova Scotia. ACAHP is a local chapter of the Canadian Association of Heritage Professionals, or CAP, which is a national membership-based organization that serves qualified heritage professionals in the public, private, and not-for-profit sectors. The ACAHP Board of Directors consists of myself, Elizabeth Cushing, Seamus McGrail, Rosa Melito, and Chris Borgel. I'll introduce each of the board member and then we'll begin our presentation. So starting with myself, Elizabeth Cushing, I'm a heritage planner with HRM with experience in both the public and private sectors. I've successfully completed heritage property registrations, heritage evaluation reports and impact assessments, property registrations, conservation plans, and other cultural heritage studies for public and private sector clients, such as HRM, City of Toronto, Town of Oakville, City of Mississauga, and the City of Hamilton. And prior to working with HRM, I had my own heritage consulting firm, Cushing Design Co., which was based out of Dartmouth. As a senior heritage planner with HRM, Seamus McGrail has led the adoption of 3 heritage conservation district plans. He works with community organizations, private property owners, and developers to register heritage properties and negotiate substantial alterations. Seamus has played a role in developing national documentation standards for historic places and led the development of the New Brunswick Register of Historic Places. Seamus worked with the community of Grand Pre, Nova Scotia, in securing their successful designation of the landscape of Grand Pre as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Rosa Melito has worked extensively in Canada and Europe for over 25 years as an architect and planner with expertise in architectural and urban conservation and cultural landscapes. She is an adjunct professor at the Dalhousie Graduate School of Architecture, teaching heritage conservation. She recently founded Heritage Workshop Studio Limited, with the vision of working at the intersection of architecture and urban conservation, by leveraging diverse cultural perspectives to protect and enhance culturally significant places. Rosa served for 2 terms as the director of ICOMOS Canada and is currently Secretary General of the ICOMOS International Scientific Committee on Energy and Sustainability. Christopher Borgel is originally from Halifax and a nationally recognized architectural heritage practitioner with over 45 years' experience on over 3,000 heritage sites across North America. These include the Royal Conservatory of Music, which received a Governor General's Award, the National Ballet School, which also received a Governor General's Award, Massey Hall, the restoration of Centre Block, Parliament Hill in the 1990s, and at legislatures including BC, Alberta, and Ontario. Chris has won over 50 local, national, and international awards and is a fellow of the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada. A reminder to my colleagues, I'll provide a 2-minute warning when we're reaching your 15-minute time limit. So without further ado, I'll hand things off to my colleague, Seamus.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Next slide, please. Hello, everybody. So as Elizabeth introduced ACAHP as an organization, it's the Atlantic Canada Regional Chapter of the Canadian Association of Heritage Professionals. So currently, the National Association has chapters covering most of Canada now, except for the Prairies and the Northwest Territories. Every other part of Canada, with the formation of the Atlantic Canada chapter last year, is covered and represented with a regional chapter. Next slide. So what exactly is a heritage professional? So heritage professional contributes to the planning and management of heritage resources. So heritage resources include buildings, cultural landscapes, museums, ancient monuments, and a variety of other places, and can include both tangible and intangible heritage resources. Here you see a photograph of one of our colleagues who's a heritage mason, Scott Harris. He's a director on CAP board. He operates Fundy Stonecraft out of Sackville, New Brunswick, and he's a good example of representation of the trades as well in the heritage profession. Heritage professionals provide expert guidance, formulate strategies, and identify solutions for heritage resources, programs, and policies. And we across all sectors, public, private, as well as not-for-profit. Next slide, please. So here are some examples of heritage professionals. We recognize CAP recognizes heritage as a field, really, not a profession in and of itself. And there's many different professions operating within the field of heritage, and a heritage professional is one of these professions within the field. They run the gamut from archaeologists to planners to architects, a lot of structural engineers entering the profession as well. You meet a lot of engineers at the conferences that we attend. Cultural tourism specialists, museum specialists, and of course the trades are well represented with heritage architects, masons, and so forth. If there's one thing that kind of is a common denominator to all of these trades, it's really they're a creative approach to the work. So heritage professionals are very, very interested in analyzing existing buildings, identifying what the needs of existing buildings are, and then synthesizing treatments and interventions in the heritage building. So it's very much a creative approach to work as opposed to a purely functional approach. So that's why the theme of this presentation really is about the creative work of heritage professionals. If there's one message we want to deliver today, is that working on a heritage building is it's not there's some misconception that it's not creative work, that you're just leaving an existing building and it kind of survives on its own. Nothing can be further from the truth. Heritage buildings need a creative investment. They need rehabilitation constantly to keep them relevant and usable and operational in a changing built environment. Next slide, please. Here are some of the streams for heritage professions, anything from heritage evaluations to heritage planning, design and construction. My two colleagues, Chris and Rosa, who are going to present today, are going to talk about some of their work in design and conservation strategies, project management, and working directly with the trades in the project management for heritage structures. Educational programming as well. Rosa will talk about some of her experience with academia, introducing heritage into architecture and planning curriculums. My work is in heritage planning, talk a bit about that, policy development, heritage conservation district plans, heritage impact assessments, working with the private sector to kind of develop heritage impact assessments for their interventions on heritage properties. And of course, evaluations, writing statements of significance, statements of heritage value, character defining elements, and so forth. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the heritage profession crosses all sectors, government, individuals and businesses, organizations. Increasingly, the CAP designation, especially in Ontario and other provinces, the CAP designation behind your name is becoming the industry standard that governments and organizations look to for as a professional standard, similar to not quite at the LPP MCIP standard yet, but we're kind of building towards that kind of certification for heritage professionals. We do keep a directory of heritage professionals on the CAP website. And we're starting to point to that directory when individuals approach municipalities, for example, asking for heritage craftspeople to work on their homes. We're increasingly, municipalities, especially at HRM, we're less inclined to provide those lists to individuals and more inclined now to point them towards organizations like CAP that keep these lists of certified heritage professionals. So why become a CAP member? There's lots of benefits to becoming a CAP member if you are in an organization and you run a heritage program or keep a heritage portfolio if you're responsible for that. CAP is a professional organization. You'll be able to use that CAP acronym behind your name, be part of this directory of heritage professionals. You'll have access to these annual awards that that the organization evaluates and gives out every year as well. Notices of job opportunities, RFPs delivered to you. There's also educational opportunities and an opportunity to make connections with other heritage professionals, and you'll be able to be involved in some of the heritage advocacy work. So some of the letters that we write to provincial governments, federal governments, and so on, so forth. Next slide, please. A big part of the field as it evolves, the heritage field as it evolves, is recognizing building reuse as climate action. One term that Carl Elefante phrased, he's an American architect, is the greenest building is the one that is already built. And if you go to the next slide, I'll explain a bit about what he means and why that's so important, such an important message to us today. So existing buildings already have carbon and energy embodied within the building. So when you reuse or rehabilitate an existing building, you're not creating carbon or generating carbon like new construction requires. So we tend to be overly concerned with the operational efficiency of buildings, but when you consider the life cycle of a building and consider its embodied energy, it makes good environmental sense, and there's environmental value as well as heritage value in maintaining existing buildings, not only heritage buildings, but existing buildings in general. You need to consider all the carbon, including supply chain, carbon emissions, embodied carbon, and operational carbon, and the assessment of options and interventions. Buildings emit GHG, carbon, greenhouse gases throughout their life cycles, including from raw material extraction, material transportation, subsequent construction, and then through operations and the demolition phase as well. So in Canada, the building sector counted as the third highest source of greenhouse gas emissions out of all industries. Institutions like the Urban Land Institute and the Canadian Urban Institute are holding webinars about this. I attended a webinar by ULI a few weeks ago where they're talking about private developers having an interest in lowering their carbon footprint in development, recognizing that the city of New York has now instituted regulatory provisions to require new construction to consider its carbon footprint. There's different ways of keeping your carbon footprint low when you build. One way is to reuse existing buildings, either through conservation or integration of those buildings into new construction. And that's just one way. There's other ways like using locally sourced materials, using wood as opposed, where appropriate, as opposed to carbon, steel and concrete. So there's other ways. Building conservation is not the only way to keep your carbon footprint low in new construction, but it's one important way, and it's one way that CAP as an organization and ACAHP are really pushing for organizations to consider the method of conservation to keep carbon low. And one additional point, studies from Germany, England, United States show that it takes about 60 years or more to recuperate the embodied energy from the building's construction in comparison to an existing building, even taking into consideration the relatively low energy consumption required for operations of new buildings. So this requires a collaborative approach if we're going to get ahead of this move to recognize carbon footprints in new construction. And we need to work with existing procurement policies. The building codes is something we need to look at as well to better encapsulate existing buildings. Building codes are generally more for new construction and don't account for existing as well. And educational programs as well, like architectural programs, tend to look at buildings on vacant lots, on vacant sites, as opposed to designing programs to integrate new buildings with new construction. And heritage professionals are are good resources for building integration, not just of heritage buildings, but of existing buildings. Working with educational programs, as I mentioned, architectural programs, even planning programs to recognize integration of existing buildings. City planning and permitting processes need to change to account for existing buildings, and of course tax credits. The United States has a great tax credit, as well as other countries, and we need some tax credits at the federal level as well to equate to our counterparts like the United States. Next slide. How much time do I have, Elizabeth? Am I?
They still have 4 minutes.
Okay, great. Thanks. So, all this talk about the environmental value, economic and tourist value of heritage conservation. It's important to get back to basics and recognize that there's value into the inherent value of contributing to our history and culture. And preserving heritage buildings. And this alone supports resilient communities and community identity. So it's important to get back to basics as well and recognize the inherent value of protecting heritage buildings. And next slide, I'll just conclude by talking a bit about my work with heritage conservation districts in Halifax. So Heritage Conservation District is a neighborhood that represents a significant era or architectural style which merits protection and recognition. HCDs typically have accompanying grant programs to help property owners conserve their properties and are regulated through specific design guidelines and demolition controls. And what we see in Halifax is there's a lot of development pressure in Halifax, especially around the downtown that you see here. And one thing we've noticed with our heritage conservation district, especially Schmidtville and Old South Suburb, Barrington Street, the capital area of Halifax, once we introduce measures of protection, regulatory provisions, architectural design guidelines, we're able to open up development. This was the case in Schmidtville, shown just to the left of the Old South Suburb. So it was an old neighborhood dating back to the 1830s. Some buildings dating back that far, all on undersized lots under the land use bylaw at the time. When we developed the Heritage Conservation District, we brought the lots into conformity, and we're able to actually increase the density on those lots and allow for missing middle development within the Heritage District. So we actually increased development potential in that neighborhood, in some cases allowing from up 4 up to 10 units in some properties along the larger. And we were able to do this because we worked with the community. We worked with community members and interested members of the public in finding that right balance between densification and heritage conservation. And the same with the Old South Suburb. We worked with local developers there. Much of the land was owned by developers at the time, and we were able to find that right balance. In some cases, as you see in the images on the bottom right, the Elmwood Hotel and the Waverly Inn, we allow for integration with medium mid-rise buildings, sort of integrating the heritage buildings. And this was appropriate in the context of the Old South Suburb. It would not be appropriate elsewhere, like in Schmidtville, but we took a different approach in the Old South Suburb, which is part of downtown Halifax. And we are seeing some facadism projects as well in Halifax. In some cases, it's appropriate. In some cases, it's not. We have introduced measures in the capital area to require a 12 meter step back above the historic street wall to preserve kind of the depth of historic buildings along the east-west streets. And we're hoping to bring the capital area forward as our 4th Heritage Conservation District this year. So with that, I will hand things over to my colleague on the board, Chris. Thank you. Sorry, Chris, you're muted.
My apologies. I'm bilingual. I speak Toronto and I speak Halifax. I'm now in Lunenburg at our house here, and so a lot of the examples are Ontario examples. The right-hand corner is Lucy Maud Montgomery's house, which is actually in Ontario. But we've done a large number of projects in the Toronto area, but it's relevant across North America for heritage work, and that might entail things such as in the southwest, the lower left image is the Girl Guides headquarters, which will be incorporated into a large development in Toronto. And the right is the Eaton Centre to the former Simpson Store bridge that we were involved with several years ago. Next, please. But from a heritage standpoint. And so Seamus, I think, has gone through a lot of what's on this page, so I'm not going to dwell on it because we're going to be a little tight for time. So we'll just go to the next page, please. One of the unifiers in approach to heritage work across Canada is the standards and guidelines for the conservation of historic places in Canada. And I actually worked for 3 years at the federal government level and while this was being written, so I'm emozed enough to suggest that I might have had some input into it. But the following these guidelines are a very sensible way of looking at, from a planning perspective, looking at how development and planning should proceed, and in fact, moving beyond that to the actual technical restoration or preservation as well. And it's a philosophical document as much as it is more than a technical document. Next, please. I've been involved in this work for a very long time and was in fact co-author of some of the earliest Heritage Conservation District plans in Ontario back in the late 1970s, early 80s. This is one, I actually had my office in this town, Goderich, Ontario, also known as Circle City because of the square or octagonal center. So Nick Hill, the late Nick Hill, and I prepared the Heritage Conservation District plan. It was reasonably successful. Next, please. I was actually president of the Architectural Conservancy of Ontario in 2009 and helped commission a report by Robert Shipley of University of Waterloo, who analyzed the impact of heritage districts. And the 78% of people were very satisfied with living and owning property in such a district. That's more related typically to residential areas rather than commercial areas, because in commercial areas people are frequently want to modernize and upgrade and not have this constraint. But it's actually very useful to actually guide the development of core areas. Next, please. The key issue, the fundamental issue popped up when an EF4 tornado went through Goderich. I think it was around 2014. Heritage Canada asked me to go back to Goderich and actually see if I could help preserve some of the oldest buildings. The one in the middle of the picture is actually an old opera hall. Unfortunately, that block and the adjacent block to above it were totally razed. Even though I visited with a structural engineer, we could have actually saved the exteriors of those buildings. But there was so much political pressure from some of the commercial community to modernize the town. And so it proved difficult. And so politics is a significant part, as all planners know, in relation to devising and perfecting these plans and making them work. I was actually a provisional member of the Canadian Institute of Planners back several decades ago, and moved more to the technical aspects of conservation. Next, please. This is another one. Town of Seaforth was a conservation district plan, but that morphed into other work. The tower on the left is the town hall, which was, I worked on that, but in the tower on the right is Cardinal's Opera Hall, another opera hall in Seaforth, Ontario, where I did a substantial amount of restoration, including reslating the roof with the decorative slates you see here. So that leads me into something that is probably not directly related to planning, but in fact flows from planning. So I'm going to give a dissertation right now on recent work at Massey Hall. I think that might be of interest to many of you if you've traveled to Toronto and looked at Gordon Lightfoot concerts. So I'm going to describe this. The original hall was subject to a heritage designation written in 1974, which is an early and not very detailed listing of attributes for the hall and what should be maintained. But there's some interesting history here. The Toronto Symphony Orchestra used this as their main base, and the ceiling, actually, at some point, a piece of that plasterwork fell on one of the orchestra members. And so when we got to it, the whole ceiling was covered in cage wire, quarter-inch wire screwed to the ceiling. And so that was the most obvious of many defects which had to be resolved. The work was a complete refit of the building and an addition of a 10-story to the rear, which allowed for new facilities which the hall had never had, including good dressing rooms and practice hall and so on and so forth. And so we work with KPMB, the design architects, in this work. We've done several projects with them. And in fact, Mitch Hall, one of their principals, was also from Halifax. So I think there was a nice maritime content in this renovation. And Gordon Lightfoot, fortunately, hadn't passed away when we opened the building, and he was able to give a performance there, which is fantastic. Anyway, next, please. The ability to do a conservation in a building of this type in Toronto is governed in part by the Heritage Preservation Services, and they're guided by the Ontario Heritage Act and the standards and guidelines that I mentioned earlier. And so the part of that process is getting a heritage approval and then having to write a conservation plan for the Preservation Services, which is part of the planning department, to ensure that what we were proposing to do would in fact meet their requirements. And the problem with a project of this complexity, though, is that you don't quite know where you're going to go with all of the details until you get there. And so we actually devised with the city a process where the conservation plan, again, as I said, this is a planning instrument, that conservation plan was a rolling plan where we were getting approvals for sections or parts of that plan as we defined the solutions to each part of it. And similarly, we had to do the same thing in other, like the Royal Alex Theatre in Toronto and others, because when you dig into these things, you don't always find an immediate answer to the issues. For instance, how far do you go with the Alhambra-esque design that the original design of the interior of the hall was based on? And that had to be a philosophical dissertation about how much we preserved and how much we didn't. And next, please. What about the windows? The windows have been completely boarded up, and I'll show an image of that in a second. And could we get light back in? I had done some experiments there years before with backlit windows, but it really wasn't as satisfactory as trying to get the original illumination back into the hall. Next, please. Those windows were still there for the most part, except for two windows which were found behind the furnace in the boiler room. Someone said, well, we can't find them. And I said, well, go check where the janitor would have stowed them, and that's where they found them. But all of the windows had been boarded up, as you can see, pretty unsightly. And this is a problem with heritage buildings of this magnitude, is that they die by death of 1,000 cuts, where people make a little intervention here, a little bit there, a little bit there, and then all of a sudden you have something that's very degraded in appearance and less deserving of its importance. Next, please. These are some details of those stained glass windows. So conservation in my world is not just from the planning standpoint, is actually knowing how and what size the H-shaped cames in the windows should be, and the saddle bars, and the process of careful removal of the windows and getting them into the hands of the proper glass conservator, and then working collaboratively with the glass conservator to be able to actually restore these elements, as with other elements, as I'll demonstrate. Next, please. And all of detailed examinations, and all of this is passed through the planning department, through the conservation plan or the evolving conservation plan, so they know at every stage just where the interventions will be and what the degree of intervention is, because one of the prime tenets of conservation is minimum intervention. And so we have to do the minimum intervention required to bring the building back to health and usability without destroying the attributes that are there. Next, please. So these are the windows as restored. And one of the challenges was that there's a helicopter landing pad on the hospital across the street, and so the windows also had to be soundproof. So there's triple glazing inside and outside of these windows, and an interior blind, which you can see on the left. The lower, that black arc is actually a roller blind, which comes up to give a blackout condition. Next, please. This is the ceiling. This is what we had to start with, and so we had a plan out how to meet the fire code, how to meet the acoustic requirements, how to meet the planning requirements for the conservation plan, and successfully restore this interior to an element where it meets current operating requirements. Next, please. And again, more meticulous work by the plasterers. The Jean-Francois Fourieri, who was the president of Iconoclast, has done theaters all up and down the east coast of North America, and a third-generation plasterer. We were very lucky. I worked with him in Ottawa on the Parliament buildings years before. Next, please. He was able to do this work. There is some preliminary work. You can see that modern framing had to be kind of introduced to get rid of the fire hazards implicit in the design of the original building. And then there were sample mock-ups made to actually create these little Alhambra-esque decorative elements. Next, please. These holes actually are another part of it. Part of the planning is actually getting the theater up to scratch so that it could compete against other newer venues in the city and allow hanging of lighting elements and other elements that drop down and then retract depending on what type of performance is going on. And in fact, the plaster was carefully designed to meet building code requirements and fire code requirements, but also selectively applied as acoustic plaster. So we actually enhanced the acoustics of the building rather than degraded it. Next, please. The fire escapes are part of that issue because, you know, both planning and building codes and fire code, in fact, if we took that fire escape off the wall, I had to say to the board that we would never get it back on again because it doesn't meet any kind of codes. And as you can see, it was pretty abusive to the front of the building where small exit balconies were added and punched right through the original Massey Music Hall sign in the front wall. So that Massey Hall sign, of course, we intended to and did restore it. And you can see it on the iconic image from Neil Young's album cover many years before. But what we did was taking the cue from the Concertgebouw, I think in Amsterdam. We hung the fire escapes on the side of the building as galleries. One side fully glazed, the other side darkened, but I'll explain that in a minute. And then, of course, the tower at the back of the building is still in construction in the upper image, but that's the service tower that we were able to put at the back of the building. But part of the planning permission for that had to do with removing a 20-foot wide original part of the building, and we had to go through a whole series of logistics to justify this change to allow us to build a 40-foot wide tower. In addition to that, there were huge complexities with planning for that tower in the background of the Massey Hall Tower, which had to be built first because they donated 20 feet of land behind the building and they had to have access for construction. So we actually built the basement up to grade, then allow concrete trucks and construction equipment to cross over for about 2 years until they were ready to release that area, and then we could build the tower up further behind. Next, please. So the intricacies.
Warning there, Chris.
I'm sorry, 1 minute? Okay, let's just flip
2 minutes.
2 minutes. Okay, well, I'll see what next slide, please. Next slide. Well, these are little details. I'm just going to go for more. This is more the masonry. Next slide, please. We have to have specialized knowledge in how to clean masonry. There's a variety of ways to clean it and a lot of monitoring. Next, please. Building was full of contaminants. This is the new part at the back, the new bar, because that's what makes theater successful, is where you go get a drink at intermission. And can you get to there from intermission? In the old arrangement, you couldn't get there in time or get to the basement in time to have a drink and go back to your seat. Next, please. And a commemorative area that was mentioned by Seamus. There's a whole commemorative thing on the blank passerelles. Next, please. That's the interior, just about finished. Next, please. Whole new rearrangement of seats. Again, more planning permissions. The seats roll under the stage to have standing room only on the main floor. Those pieces in the foreground were restored. Next, please. There's another wider view. Next, please. And that's it as you see it today. And so Massey Hall Music Hall is new. We have stonemasons who were able to carve. All of these technical issues had to be known about and resolved in the planning process, and the work with the planning department to be able to actually get all the permissions that we needed to make this work. The upper, just one final comment, the upper pediment above, you see it looks like there's some roughness to it. There were originally sculptures of a band up there, and they really wouldn't stand the weather, and they were removed very early on. And we had a big debate about whether to restore those or not. And we've left the image of it. And so there's a whole philosophical issue of how far do you go and how do you leave examples of changes over time. So anyway, that's not entirely related to planning, but in fact, planning is the key to getting all of this done in terms of getting all the permissions as you go forward. So it hasn't got a Governor General's award yet, but we're expecting that we probably will be a good candidate for it. So thank you very much, and we'll turn it over to, I guess, Rosa's next.
Hello. Sorry. Good afternoon. I'm going to talk about a case of urban conservation in Italy. I'm Italian, so I worked over there for more than 10 years before moving and working in North Europe before England and Ireland, and then coming to Canada. So in this case, sorry, one moment, I just a sip of water. In this case, I have to, as a premise, the urban legislative framework in Italy is slightly different from Canada. So we have the zoning, of course, that is developed under the urban development plans, and it includes area of cultural heritage significance, which is called Zone A. Additionally, there are regional and national laws that require the definition of more in-depth programs to enable the management and development within areas of cultural significance. The development of this urban complex plan was falling under the regional law, under a regional law in Campania near Naples. And that was for the safeguard and valorization of the historical significant areas in the municipal territory. It comprises three It comprises three projects. One is a valorization plan, which is basically a strategic plan in which all actions were identified in planning, future planning. Then another part was the cultural heritage cataloging. And the third part was the conservation plan for all the historical part of the historical area for contributing and non-contributing buildings. Just as a note, this plan was a requirement to enable regional, national, and European grants program. So the participation to those grants program required this planning to be in place. And also the zoning in the Zone A was subordinated to the development of these guidelines. Next slide, please. So, no, I don't know why we have. Okay. So yeah. So yes. Yeah. Go. The first one. Yeah. Okay. I think I already went through this. So yeah, the three parts. So we can move forward. Thank you, Elizabeth. Okay. This is an example of the a drawing and some photos, part of the strategic plan, the valorization plan. It was a study that included research and analysis to identify the perimeter of all areas, settlements, systems, and ensembles of cultural significance within the municipal territory. In the photos, we can see the conditions. I mean, they were studied. Furthermore, the plan was quite substantial. And this is the in the drawings we can see the identification of different systems and the boundary in the perimeter of the areas. So it's not just focusing on one area, but also has the examples and different rural, vernacular heritage and other modern heritage that are in the area in the territory. Next slide, please. Okay, the second part of this complex project was the cataloging campaign, which was a comprehensive yet punctual study aiming at achieving a complete inventory of the built and urban heritage, supported by research and analysis of current conditions. It was developed in line with the Italian National Institute of Cataloging Standards. We have a part of the Ministry of Cultural Ministry. There is the Institute of Cataloging, where that has standard in place for the inventory of heritage resources at a different level, from territory to the actual object of art. The methodology, we can go next slide, please. Okay, sorry, in the first one, can you go before? In the first one, we just see some archival documentation that we based our cataloging on. The first one is a drawing of the original, one of the oldest cadastral map, which have the identification of all the information of all properties. In 1867, something like that. And then there was the aerial photo and also several archival documents. Next slide, please. This is just the methodology, basically narrowed down in terms of scale and analysis from the territorial system to the individual contributing element. In these drawings, we can see the preliminary identification of areas on study areas. That's kind of the level 0 of the study for the cataloging. Next slide, please. Each area then was further studied with level 1, 2, and 3 analysis. And we have here in this drawing kind of a summary of all the cataloging standard documentation forms, which are documentation forms with the required attachment, archival research, and so on and so forth. So from the general to the actual punctual property. Individual property. Next slide, please. I'm trying to be in 15 minutes. So this is an example of some of attachment that were supporting the study of the urban blocks within the historical settlement. So the analysis was started with the analysis of the urban streetscape. You can see the elevation of the streets. We did the elevation for all streets, and as well as study the first floor, the kind of the urban sector, urban fabric for typology, conditions, and the relationships between open spaces and closed space, both private and public spaces. Next slide, please. In the third project of this complex program was the urban color plan. The urban color plan is not only looking at the colors, but also looking at the materials. We also we have a very long established tradition of the use of local materials, architectural details, colors related to the pigmentation, to the pigments that are historically available in certain area. So if you go in Italy, but also in Europe, there is this, but different areas of the peninsula, they have different characteristic colors that are also related to the pigmentation, natural pigmentation available in the area. Next slide, please. So the plan was the plan was actually aiming at providing an analysis, providing guidelines, norms, and planning tools for for the approval process of planning application for the facade. The first part of the plan was identifying a number of areas within for the study purposes within the historical identified areas, within the historical settlement, but also outside. Each area then was further studied up to the individual property. The study included also the study of plaster, the analysis. These are photos that are taken while sampling was taken in order to do laboratory analysis for plaster and pigmentation. Next slide, please. This was another part of the study, that the analysis, so kind of a detailed study of decorative patterns, architectural patterns, and windows, type of elements, architectural elements, and also an analysis of the pigmentation, the traditional pigmentation based on the codified with the use of the Munsell code, and and of course supported by the investigations that were done on a few buildings, the most representative buildings selected within the territory. Next slide, please. So this is an example of this is an example of an analysis more in detail of the alteration of a streetscape on the first elevation, and in the second colored elevation is a proposal for guidelines in terms of colors, which were also related to a table that we prepared for to guide the new interventions on both historical and not historical, not contributing properties. So kind of having this idea, these principles that the contemporary intervention are subordinated to the historical intervention. So the historical colors were only identified as the appropriate use of the historical colors and historical pigmentation on the actual identified contributing buildings, and there were also differences between them, but that's too deep to discuss now. Next slide, please. This is another example of a longer streetscape. Next slide. And this is an example of a modern architecture. It's a housing complex, 1940s, quite relevant in terms of modern architecture in Italy. This area is also designated under the national designation for cultural heritage, and was part of the study in terms of norming the exterior of this work. Of this complex. Basically, these urban complex programs was and is still in force after, I think, 20 years. Was done 20 years ago, pretty much, which I'm surprised. I was very young at the time, and helps in protecting and enhancing and also supporting the development within historical areas. A little bit like the heritage conservation districts do in the function of the heritage conservation districts in Canada. Can we move forward, please? Next slide. Thank you. So I'm now talking about my experience as a professor at the School of Architecture. Besides running my own company, I also work part-time as an adjunct professor. I'm an adjunct professor at the Dalhousie Graduate School of Architecture. My course is part of the humanity seminars. So it focuses on the understanding and assessment of cultural heritage towards enabling the creative part of rehabilitation that actually from this year I will take it forward within a design studio specific in conservation, urban systems and conservation, which I will deliver at the graduate school. Can we move forward, please? So I have some example of student work that I want to show you.
Sure, so we're just running a little bit low on time if you wanted to choose one of the examples.
Yeah, I'm just going through very quick. I think it's so the idea is, I mean, this is a fishing village. The idea is always starting with the identification of with the research, then identification of potential resources, assessment of cultural values, and therefore identification of vulnerabilities and risks for the protection, and then moving forward to suggesting some compatible intervention. This is a case of analysis in fishing villages in Blue Rocks in the South Shore. We have to move forward, so I'm sorry, but we're short in time. That's the intervention that part of the evaluation of the cultural heritage, and the intervention, the study, just an intervention, just very much as a concept, because this is not a design studio. A design studio. Now, next slide, please. This is another work that the student did on the Dominion Railway. So as you can see, the idea is understanding the system, kind of extended to the regional or to the municipal area, depending on the system. In this case was the Dominion Railway, and then assessing the parts, and assessing the contributing element to the heritage related to that system. This was the Dominion Railway. We can go ahead. We can go next slide. That's some kind of proposed study, proposed intervention, kind of punctual, but also kind of having this comprehensive and overview on the different on the system. Next slide, please. This was another study that the student did within the historical urban landscape, kind of more approaching towards with the lens of the historical urban landscape, kind of understanding the stratification, which was in the north end of Halifax and Idlestone, so that area. Next slide, please. We worked at so some of the students then in the last phase, which kind of the proposal of conservation treatment and a creative approach, they identified the importance of Fort Needham in this case, and proposed a kind of an interpretation of the fort in this case was by subtraction, but kind of how to also interpret elements that have been completely destroyed, because there is if you go in Fort Needham, which is a cultural landscape, there is nothing, there is no footprint, nothing related to the actual fort. Next slide, please. This is another example of a student work which was on a cultural landscape. This was the 20th century military fortification in Sydney. There is a complex of eight buildings that part of those system of fortification. The student analyzed that as part of a cultural landscape, and also the analysis, the research. Then there was the assessment, which is summarized in this slide. Next slide. I'm trying to this kind of some comparing the cultural heritage area with the zoning, and see how the zoning, if the zoning integrated those values or not. In this case, probably not. Some elements that were identified as contributing, including the contemporary use of some of those buildings by the new generation that do. There is a lot of graffiti and things. Those elements were also considered as part of the layers of the on the site. So not only the original part, but also all the layers that come from the original buildings up to the uses. So kind of understanding the historical uses, understanding what can be, what is compatible and what is not compatible with the rehabilitation of this. Next slide, please. And this is the last one. This is an example of one of the students that identified the needs for connection, because there is no path that right now connect this fortification. So this is kind of an example. Of course, as I said, this is not a course for a design course. So just the students were approaching this as a very early concept idea, but they had to assess the idea against the assessed cultural values of the previous phases.
Great,
And,
Rosa. I think we have to wrap things up. If we're going to leave a minute or two for questions here.
Okay, perfect.
So I hope this provides everyone with some sense of the creative work of rehabilitation and of heritage professionals. Heritage professionals are creative professionals, and heritage conservation is a creative industry, which is supported by legislation like the Heritage Property Act. Although Heritage Place may seem unchanged, in reality, a lot of creative planning and interventions go into keeping a Heritage Place vibrant and relevant in our changing environment, especially a rapidly changing environment that we experience in HRM. From heritage planning, architectural interventions for rehabilitation to educational programs that you've seen today, the field of heritage itself is constantly evolving. Elizabeth, should we open things up? I think we have maybe a minute or two for questions, maybe.
Yes, if anyone has any questions, if you'd like to just raise your hand, or there's also the chat. We'll give some time.
I think we started a little bit later, so maybe if everybody's welcome to stay.
Maybe while we wait, if there are any closing comments or last points that any of our presenters would like to make, this would be a good time for that.
No, I think I summed it up. There's a question from Sean there in the chat. See if I can access the chat here.
I can read them if that
Sure,
helps.
yeah.
So Sean is asking, is there much progress on getting the public realm sorted, in brackets, nicer, in heritage districts?
Yeah, so I'll speak from the HRM experience. We do have policies in all of our heritage conservation district plans to invest in streetscaping. So the streetscaping projects that you see on Argyle Street and most recently on Spring Garden Road, we do have our streetscaping colleagues in HRM do have a plan to eventually focus on Barrington Street and Old South Suburb and make those sorts of investments in the streetscapes in line with the policies in the Heritage Conservation District plan. So it is on the radar of our streetscaping folks. We also have some mentions in policy in these plans to preserve aspects of the public realm, like the granite curbs, for example, and some of the lighting standards, making them have a historic look and feel. So there are provisions. But I agree, Sean. The public realm of the heritage conservation districts could use some attention, especially in HRM. All right, I know it's running late past most people's lunchtime now. So if there's no further questions, Elizabeth, I think we can probably wrap things up. I don't see any hands raised or anything like that. If you have any questions, if anybody has any questions about the work we do, feel free to reach out to myself. I can put you in contact, or Elizabeth can put you in contact with Rosa or Chris or any other heritage professional within our organization at ACAHP and CAP. And then we do encourage you to join if you, as I mentioned, if you are responsible for a heritage program or a heritage portfolio, or you have some heritage experience and you want to become a member, then that is a possibility as well. Any one of us can serve as a what do you call that, sponsor or a mentor, if you wish.
I put our website in the chat if you'd like to check that out. So we are always looking for new members and are happy to answer any questions that you might have about the process. Thanks everyone for your time.
All right.
Have a good day.
Thanks.